History remembers kings and knights, but it forgets the hands that built their kingdoms. This is not the story of crowns or castles. This is the story of the common folk, the villagers, the farmers, the mothers, and the children, who carried the weight of the medieval world on their shoulders. Their lives were harsh, their joys fleeting, yet their spirit was unbreakable. This is their untold story. The medieval day did not begin with the ringing of clocks or the hum of machines. It began with the crow of a rooster, the creak of wooden shutters, and the slow stirrings of life in a village surrounded by endless fields. For the common folk of the Middle Ages, the village was not just home. It was the entire world. Imagine a cluster of small wooden huts, their thatched roofs smoking faintly from cooking fires. A muddy path winds between them, leading to the church at the center, the beating heart of the community. Beyond the village, farmland stretches out like a patchwork quilt, stitched together by sweat, hope, and back-breaking labor. Inside the huts, families rise with the sun. The air is heavy with the smell of straw and smoke. Children sleep 3 or 4 to a bed, often sharing with livestock for warmth. Their parents are already awake, pulling on rough wool garments, ready for another day that promises little change. For the medieval peasant, life was a cycle. Work, eat, pray, sleep, repeat. Breakfast is simple: a hunk of bread, maybe some porridge if grain is left, and ale instead of water, for the wells are often foul. A piece of cheese or dried meat would be a luxury, saved for special days. The meals are plain, but they are fuel for the endless work that follows. As the sun climbs higher, the village comes alive. Men shoulder wooden plows, oxen drag them into the fields, and women tend to the smaller animals: chickens, goats, and pigs. Children fetch water from the stream or gather kindling for the fire. Everyone, young or old, has a role. There is no such thing as idleness in the medieval village. Every pair of hands is needed for survival. Life is simple, but never easy. A storm could destroy crops, a harsh winter could freeze livestock, and hunger was a constant shadow. Yet the people endured. They laughed, they quarreled, they fell in love, and they clung to their faith. For them, heaven promised a reward far greater than anything the earth could give. As evening falls, the village gathers again. Smoke curls from chimneys, and the air fills with the scent of stew simmering in iron pots. Families sit together telling stories or singing songs, their faces lit by the flicker of firelight. The world outside may have been filled with wars, knights, and kings, but for the villagers, the rhythm of life beat quietly within the boundaries of their small, fragile world. The village was their cradle and their cage, and tomorrow, at dawn, the same cycle would begin again. For the medieval villager, the fields were both a blessing and a burden, the very ground on which survival depended. From the moment the first light of dawn touched the soil to the fading glow of sunset, the rhythm of life pulsed through the earth beneath their feet. Step into the fields of a medieval village and you would find a world of constant labor. Men guided heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen, their boots sinking deep into the mud. Women bent low, planting seeds with hands roughened by years of work. Children, too small to plow, scattered grain for chickens, scared away crows, or helped gather bundles of wood. There was no idle season. Each day carried a duty, each month a task, and the cycle of the land governed the fate of every soul. Spring was the season of hope. Seeds of wheat, barley, or rye were pressed into the damp earth. The work was exhausting, but every seed carried a prayer that it would grow tall and golden, and not wither under disease or storms. Summer brought endless days of tending, weeding, and guarding the fields. There was little rest, for weeds never slept, and animals never respected boundaries. Harvest time was both joy and dread. Villagers worked from sunrise to moonlight, swinging sickles and gathering sheaves of grain. Sweat poured, backs ached, but this was the moment the entire year led up to. If the harvest was good, bellies would be full through the winter. If it failed, hunger and despair awaited. And then came winter. The fields grew quiet under frost and snow, but the struggle did not end. Villagers rationed what little grain and dried meat they had stored. Hunger gnawed, sickness spread in the cold, and survival became a gamble of endurance. To the medieval peasant, the land was not owned but borrowed. Lords and nobles claimed the soil, and the villagers labored as tenants, giving a share of their crops as rent. For their sweat and toil, they kept just enough to live. Barely. The earth gave life, but it also reminded them of their place. Lowly, dependent, and bound to the land. And yet, in the fields, there was a kind of simple beauty. The songs of workers carried across the wind. The smell of freshly cut hay sweetened the summer air. Families worked side by side, bound together by necessity. The soil, harsh and unyielding, also united them in common struggle. For the villagers, the fields were not just earth. They were the stage of their existence. The silent witness to generations who lived, loved, struggled, and dreamed within its furrows. Tomorrow the work would begin again. The plow would bite into the soil, the sweat would fall, and the story of survival would continue beneath the wide medieval sky. If the fields were the lifeblood of the medieval village, the marketplace was its beating heart. For common folk, the market was more than a place of trade. It was a place of color, noise, gossip, and fleeting escape from the harsh rhythm of daily toil. Picture a dusty square at the center of a town, alive with the clamor of voices. Wooden stalls stand crookedly side by side, their tables piled with baskets of grain, wheels of cheese, cuts of salted meat, and bundles of wool. The air is thick with the mingling scents of fresh bread, sweat, livestock, and smoke from nearby hearths. Peasants arrive with whatever they can spare. A farmer might carry eggs in a basket, hoping to trade them for a pot or a length of cloth. A woman may bring butter or herbs she has gathered, her eyes scanning the stalls for shoes her children desperately need. For many, coins are scarce. Barter is king. A jug of ale could buy a loaf of bread. A chicken might be traded for a patch of cloth. The market is not only about survival, it is also about connection. Villagers meet neighbors they rarely see. Outside the fields, news travels quickly here. Rumors of wars, whispers of kings and lords, or the latest scandal from the church. To the common folk, the market is their window to the wider world. Yet it is not free from hardship. Lords and sheriffs often patrol, demanding taxes or fees for selling goods. A portion of what is earned rarely stays in the villager's pocket. Even in this lively space, the heavy hand of authority is felt. Still the peasants return week after week, for here they find what little choice life allows them. Beyond the everyday bustle, larger fairs were moments of wonder. Once or twice a year, great traveling markets arrived, drawing crowds from distant villages. Bright tents rose in the fields, filled with strange spices, shining trinkets, and fabrics dyed in colors most peasants had never dreamed of. Jugglers, musicians, and storytellers filled the air with laughter. For a brief moment, life felt richer, lighter, and far from the shadow of toil. But when the fair ended, the villagers returned to their humble lives, carrying with them a memory of music, taste, or scent that lingered long after. The market gave them more than goods. It gave them a glimpse of possibility, a sense that the world beyond their small village was vast and filled with wonders. For the medieval common folk, the market was both necessity and luxury. It was where hunger was eased, where friendships were kindled, and where dreams briefly came alive beneath the crowded stalls and echoing laughter. Tomorrow the villagers would be back in the fields. But for now, in the noise of the marketplace, they found a piece of life worth remembering. For the common folk of the Middle Ages, faith was not just belief. It was the air they breathed, the rhythm of their days, and the hope that carried them through hunger, sickness, and endless toil. Religion was everywhere, in the tolling of church bells, in the paintings on chapel walls, in the whispered prayers before a meager meal. To live in a medieval village was to live under the gaze of God. At the center of nearly every village stood the church. Its steeple, though small compared to great cathedrals in distant cities, towered above the huts and fields. It was more than a place of worship. It was the anchor of the community. Here, villagers gathered on Sundays, dressed in their best, tunics and gowns, to hear Mass in Latin words few understood. Yet the rituals, the candles, and the incense spoke louder than language. In those moments, the poorest peasant could feel part of something eternal. Life was harsh, and death was never far away. Disease, famine, and war struck without warning. The church gave meaning to these struggles, teaching that suffering on earth was only temporary, that heaven awaited the faithful. This promise comforted the weary and gave strength to those who had little else. But faith was not only solemn. It also brought joy, color, and celebration through festivals. The medieval calendar was dotted with feast days: Christmas, Easter, Midsummer, and countless saints' days. These moments broke the endless cycle of labor, filling villages with music, dancing, and laughter. Imagine a festival day. The church bells ring out, echoing across the fields. Work stops, and villagers gather in the square. Tables are laden with bread, roasted meat, and mugs of ale. Musicians play flutes and drums, children chase one another through the crowd, and even the sternest elders join in the dances. Bright ribbons flutter, fires blaze, and for a fleeting time, the burdens of life are set aside. Weddings, too, were celebrations of both faith and festivity. They were often arranged for family survival, but on the day itself, joy filled the air. The bride in her brightest gown, the groom with garlands of greenery, and the entire village gathered to feast, sing, and share in the happiness. For a few nights, the poverty of daily life was forgotten in the glow of firelight and the sound of music. Faith and festivals were two sides of the same coin. One offered hope in hardship. The other offered joy in the moment. Together, they reminded the common folk that life, though brief and filled with trials, could also hold meaning, beauty, and celebration. In the quiet of prayer and the chaos of dancing, the villagers found the strength to endure, and to live not only for survival, but for the promise of something greater. For all its faith and festivals, life for the common folk of the Middle Ages was often overshadowed by suffering. To be a peasant was to live close to the edge, where a single poor harvest, a sudden sickness, or the march of soldiers could destroy everything a family had struggled to build. Hunger was a constant companion. A wet summer could rot the grain, and a cold winter could freeze livestock. When the harvest failed, the consequences were immediate. Bread became scarce, and families survived on thin gruel or boiled weeds pulled from the edge of the fields. Children cried through the night, their bellies empty, while parents looked on helplessly. Malnutrition weakened bodies, and the simplest illness could carry people to the grave. Disease haunted the medieval world like a shadow. Fevers, infections, and epidemics swept through villages without warning. The most feared of all was the plague, the Black Death of the 14th century, which left entire towns silent and empty. For the villagers who survived, the memory of carts piled high with the dead and churches filled with mourners never faded. Life could be snatched away in days, and there was no cure, no escape, only prayer. And then there was war. When kings and lords quarreled, it was not the nobles who suffered most, but the peasants. Armies marched across farmland, trampling crops, seizing animals, and burning villages to the ground. A family might wake to the sound of hooves and find their world reduced to ashes by nightfall. Many peasants were forced to fight, wielding crude weapons, while others fled into the forests, carrying what little they could on their backs. Even in times of peace, Injustice weighed heavily. Taxes and rents were demanded regardless of famine or illness. The peasants, bound by duty to their lords, often found themselves trapped in cycles of debt. Their labor enriched others, while their own families went hungry. Resentment brewed, and though uprisings were rare, when they came, they were desperate cries for dignity. Cries that were often crushed with brutal force, yet even in the face of such suffering, the villagers endured. They leaned on one another, sharing what little they had. A neighbor might bring bread to a starving child. A village might rebuild a burned home together. Survival was never guaranteed, but community gave strength. The shadow of suffering never left the medieval peasant. It was a constant reminder of the fragility of life, but it also forged resilience. For every plague, for every famine, for every raid or fire, the villagers rose again, rebuilding, replanting, and praying for a better tomorrow. They had no choice. To live was to endure, and to endure was to hope. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often picture kings on thrones, knights in shining armor, or cathedrals rising toward the heavens. Yet beneath these grand images lies the true foundation of the medieval world, the countless common folk, whose sweat, faith, and endurance carried society through centuries of hardship. Their legacy is not written in gilded books or carved in marble, but it lives in the very fabric of history. The peasants built the world with their hands. Every loaf of bread baked, every furrow plowed, every stone lifted for castles and cathedrals. How? All bore the mark of their labor. Without them, the noble courts would have starved, the armies would have faltered, and the great cities would never have risen. The humble villager, unknown by name, was in truth the silent architect of medieval life. But their legacy is more than toil. It is resilience. Generation after generation faced hunger, plague, and war, yet they endured. They rebuilt villages after fires, replanted fields after storms, and raised children in a world that promised little comfort. Their quiet strength ensured that life continued, even when history seemed determined to crush them. In time, their endurance gave birth to change. As centuries passed, peasants began to demand more than survival. Revolts shook the feudal order in England, France, and beyond, as common folk rose against crushing taxes and unfair laws. Though often defeated, their voices could not be silenced forever. Slowly, the bonds of serfdom weakened, and the idea that even the lowly had rights began to take root. The Black Death, devastating as it was, also shifted power. With so many lives lost, labor became precious, and peasants could bargain for better conditions. Markets grew, towns expanded, and a new middle class began to emerge. The seeds of change, sown by suffering, would eventually lead Europe out of the Middle Ages and into the dawn of the Renaissance. Yet perhaps the greatest legacy of the common folk is the reminder of what it means to be human. They lived simple lives, but they loved deeply. They sang songs by the fire, told stories to their children, celebrated festivals with joy, and buried their dead with tears. Their struggles and hopes were not so different from ours. In their laughter and sorrow, we see ourselves. The story of the Middle Ages is not only the story of kings and knights, but of villagers who never saw their names in chronicles, who never wore crowns or wielded swords. Their lives were ordinary, yet together they shaped an extraordinary era. And though centuries have passed, their legacy endures. In every field still plowed, every market still bustling, and every community still bound together by shared struggle and hope. Through hunger and plague, through toil and war, the common folk endured. Their names were never etched in stone, yet their spirit is written across history itself. Every field tilled, every song sung, every stone lifted. It was their legacy that carried the medieval world forward. And though kings wore crowns, it was the peasants who bore the weight of the world. Remember them, for without the common folk, there would be no history at all.